Today is December 28th, 2021, and my guest is documentary filmmaker Penny Lane. Her latest documentary, which is airing on HBO, which is our topic for today, is Listening to Kenny G. I want to remind listeners to go to EconTalk.org to vote on your favorite episodes of 2021. Penny, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Now, Kenny G is a pretty successful recording artist, as we used to call them, and some still do. Give us an idea of just how successful.
Well, actually, it's funny. When I started this film, I really didn't get how successful he was. I mean, I knew he was kind of ubiquitous in the 90s, which is where I came to know him, as many people did. But it wasn't until I got into the research of it that I realized that he's one of the top-selling artists of all time. If you look at a list of the top-selling artists, he's like 25. He's higher than Nirvana, higher than the Velvet Underground, higher than, I'm sure, many of your listeners' favorite artists. So he really exemplifies a particular era of the recording industry where you could sell a ton of records. Like, that was a particularly small moment in history, and he came along at that moment and took advantage of it.
And at some point, he sold 75 million albums, and he would have sold a ton more if people still bought albums. He's just...
Yes, exactly.
And he's the most best-selling, I think, instrumental artist of all time. He doesn't sing. He's not a band. He's just him. He has musicians play with him, but he's a solo act, essentially. He's got a Grammy. Only one. Probably irks him. We'll talk about that. He's got one Grammy. And he's got a string of unbelievably successful albums, and he's just totally beloved and adored by the critical community too, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what the film's about, how much critics love Kenny G.
Yeah, they can't stop gushing about him.
So yes, you're right. An instrumental artist, that's very important because he's a unicorn in that way. You know, it's one thing to be Whitney Houston or Celine Dion or Michael Jackson, but we're talking about someone who plays the saxophone. There are some vocal tracks on his albums, but not at his behest. And he pretty much just plays saxophone, and that's what made him so successful, which is very unique. There are no other instrumental artists like that.
And the other thing I learned a lot of interesting things about Kenny G and the world, and many of them were thought-provoking. That's, of course, what we're going to talk about. But there's one unbelievable thing that I couldn't get over. His first hit was Songbird, which I couldn't have named. I couldn't have told you this until I saw this. I couldn't have named a single Kenny G song. And I have to confess from the get-go, I'm not a fan. I don't hate him, but I'm not a fan. It's not my thing. It's okay. But a lot of people really love his music. Normal people, not critics. Normal people love his music, obviously. But one of the things I learned is his song, Going Home. Talk about the role Going Home plays in the world. I don't know if you exaggerated a little bit. It's hard to believe, and it was kind of creepy, but talk about that.
I don't think I exaggerated it. If anything, I'm underplaying it. But yes, so there's a song called Going Home, which was one of his hits in the early 90s, mid 90s. And somebody in China had a bootleg of this album. And you have to realize Kenny G's music circulated in China during an era where such music was banned. It was banned just the same as the Rolling Stones. So it was seen as subversive. But these bootlegs circulated, and he became very popular in China. And it's somebody along the way, some mall owner or shopkeeper, decided that it would make sense to play this song Going Home at the end of the day to signal to shoppers that it's time to go home. Remember, this is just called Going Home. There's no lyrics or anything.
It doesn't say, hey, go home, right? But it's called Going Home.
But it's funny because, not to digress too much, but the title of the song, Going Home, I'm sure he meant it as like kind of coming home, and it's this kind of warm, nostalgic, sentimental feeling. But for it to be used, but we didn't finish the story. So at some point, someone decided to use it as a go home song. And over the years, this became a huge tradition in China. And people kept telling me, oh, yeah, I know that song, or I know Kenny G because I'm from China. And I hear this song literally every day, all the time, at every mall, schools, punk clubs, hospitals. They'll play this song when it's time to go home And they don't just play it once, they loop it for like anywhere from 20 to 40 to 60 minutes. And it's just part of the fabric of everyday life in China. Now, I, like you, thought this must be exaggerated. Like, this can't be like so common. It can't be happening everywhere all the time.
Okay, once in a mall, somebody played it and people thought, oh, I wonder what the name of that song is. Oh, it's Going Home. We went home. But that's not it.
No. And so it was during the pandemic we made this film. So I was not able to go to China myself. So we hired a remote crew there and we said, okay, we have about 2 days in the budget of shooting. Get us as many examples of this as you can. And I kind of thought maybe they'd come up with, 3 or 4 in Beijing, but they came back with 30 or 40 examples just in 2 days that they were able to find easily and film for me. And so I started to and I asked all of my Chinese friends, do you know this song? And even if they don't know what it's called or who made it, they all know it. Like, everyone knows it. So it's this kind of weapon of mass, control in this strange, creepy way in China.
Yeah, well, one of the film critics found it particularly creepy that you interviewed, who used it as a sign of compliance and sort of subservience to the totalitarian regime. And so when you hear that song in a kind of a Pavlovian way, you find yourself unintentionally getting up from your seat and heading toward the exits. That was the claim. I don't know if that's really true. I did, in preparation for this interview, I want to let you know, I did play Going Home on Spotify on my walk home from work just to see if it was as calming, because some people love this song, right? And I thought, I'm just going to see if I can get into it a little bit. It's kind of a nice melody. It's not bad. I didn't... Mark Knopfler has a song, Going Home, that's part of the soundtrack of Local Heroes, one of my favorite melodies of all time. I love listening to that song. And I put that on afterward just to kind of cleanse my palate. But that's an amazing thing. That's an amazing...
It is an amazing thing, yes.
And he claims, what's his claim about his concert in China?
He claims that when he plays in China, he has to play Going Home at the end, because if he plays it in the middle, everyone will just stand up and leave. Probably a joke. Maybe there's some truth to it. I really don't know.
Hard to know.
But it's funny because, you brought up what Ben Ratliff said. And Ben Ratliff, the New York Times jazz critic, said about this song, is Kenny G's music a weapon of consent?
Does it make you... the phrase, yeah.
Yeah, does it make you agree to comply? And look, normally I'd say, oh, this is kind of this old school, sort of Frankfurt School argument about mass culture that's really kind of silly, and that's not how it works. But this feels like a pretty special case, doesn't it? Where maybe it applies?
A little bit. Although, the idea that you show some scenes of the gym emptying out and the lights going off around the exercise equipment, I don't think that's really the worst sin of the Chinese government. So it might be okay. And it might be kind of a nice thing.
Depends who you ask, I guess. Yeah.
Fair enough. I guess the idea that you could play it for your guests at a dinner party too. It's like, when they won't leave, it's like you put it in the background, pipe it in, and it's like, oh, yes, it's late. We'll go home now. I don't know. Could have some other uses. But anyway, before we get into some of the details of the film and the ideas in it, try to summarize the critical view. We're joking around because there's a comic element to this, which is unavoidable, but there's this very, very serious element. Here's a person, another thing I learned, he practices 3 hours a day, and it sounds like he really does, not just talk. He's really good at his craft, takes it extremely seriously. He's an incredibly successful person at what he does. He does other things well, and he's happy to tell you about them. He golfs and flies a plane and parents, and he parents his children. He's very proud of all those things. But here's a guy who's, what an incredible career. He's in his 60s. He sold all these records. And if you count the bootlegs, by the way, he's way over 100 million. So why is he not loved by the establishment, the jazz critical establishment, jazz musicians? Why is he disliked? And not just not appreciated, actually actively disliked?
That is the question of the film. That is the question that I set out to ask and try to find some answers to, because I think, okay, here's this person whose music I do not like. I'm in the same camp as you, not a fan, but the sound of his music doesn't make my blood boil either. Right? It's just like, oh yeah, not for me, not my thing. Wouldn't put it on a dinner party mix, you know. But I knew my whole life, ever since I was a teenager, that Kenny G was like the object, not just of dislike or disdain, but like ridicule and hatred. And that is what I was interested in. There's some comedy to that, as you've already alluded to. I think it's funny that this like incredibly inoffensive music could cause such offense. But I also was aware from the beginning that this is a very small group of people that we're talking about. Like, who hates Kenny G is a particular group of people. It is not even half or 10% of the population. Most people love Kenny G. And when I tell people that my film is asking the question, why do some people hate Kenny G? Most people say, who hates Kenny G? Yeah. Like, what's wrong with you? It's like hating Christmas or Disneyland or something. So it's important to say that, because I don't know where your audience would fall on this. I don't know, actually, if people in your audience tend to hate him or love him or never thought about him at all. What do you think?
Well, the other thing that has to be said, and it's really quite powerful in the film, and I found it very moving, he's the soundtrack for a lot of people's lives. Their romance, their weddings, their children's weddings. He's not just, I like his music. He's deeply woven into the memories and associations people have of their lives. And there's something, and a few of the critics do concede this, that you talk to, there's something pathetic about hating this. I mean, right? And again, it's what they say, hey, I wouldn't put him on if I were walking my child down the aisle. It's nothing to say, boy, if anybody who likes him, something's wrong with him. And that's sort of their attitude. We'll come to Pat Metheny in a little bit, but another jazz musician, and his attitude, which I think is probably representative of many serious jazz musicians. I want to say one thing. Kenny G is on somewhere in the pop, jazz, instrumentals, easy listening, smooth jazz. There's a lot of different ways of describing what he is. He doesn't like to be labeled, obviously. But he plays a jazz instrument. And I think that's part of the reason he plays it differently than many people. He plays it in a way that I would say is outside of the tradition of jazz, certainly outside of the tradition of black jazz musicians who he is, I don't know what you want to call it, in some tradition of, but not artistic tradition of. And I think that's part of it. But it's not the only part. It's the, to be cruel to him and unfair, I would say there's a saccharine aspect to his music that offends people who don't like saccharine.
Oh, yeah. Saccharine, sentimental. I mean, I think the best word for this is something like kitsch or maybe schmaltz. These are two words that kind of circulated in my mind as I was making it. Like these are the things that people think about him. Like if they hate him, it's because it's kitschy or schmaltzy or corny. Yeah. And so it's not just that he's like playing a version of jazz that people who are obsessed with jazz and love jazz and really care about the jazz tradition find offensively adulterated, let's say, but also that the music he makes, even in a pop tradition, is kind of not the type of music that music critics love. I mean, that's never been the case. Music critics have never liked schmaltz. I would think that most music critics would think it was right. Most music critics would think their job was to like disabuse people of their like of that kind of music.
That's very well said. We're now at a landmark moment of EconTalk. I'm going to, I think, mention for the first time Hegel, the philosopher, and I bring him up because we recently spoke with Megan McArdle about Roger Scruton's book, Where We Are, and is following up on that, I decided to read Scruton's book, The Uses of Pessimism, which is a fabulously interesting book. And one of the things he says in there is he talks about Hegel's theory of sort of history and art, and he says Hegel really contaminated Western appreciation of art and aesthetics by implying there's some kind of progress. There's some kind of, progress. And what he's getting at there, and he talks about how he influenced Burckhardt and others, but what he's trying to get at, and this was extremely helpful for me reading this book in conjunction with the Kenny G, your documentary, is that in the critical world, the art is supposed to disturb you. It's supposed to shake you up. It's supposed to challenge you. If you like it right away, it's not good art. Can't be, almost by definition. And Kenny G's work is not jarring. It's not challenging. You can like it the first time. You might not like it as much the 10th time, like you might say with The Rite of Spring or Schoenberg or others, or Miles Davis or Coltrane. But a lot of people like it the first time, and they're totally happy with that. And in the aesthetics of the critical world, that makes it a failure.
Yeah, I love that you used the word failure. And I thought a lot about this. It's important to say that I started this project in my head when I was an art professor. So I was an art professor for 12, 13 years, and over time became intensely uncomfortable with my own power as a critical arbiter of what is good. I mean, you can say all day that you don't have power as a professor, but you sure do, because you're like, telling your students on the one hand, because this is true if you're intellectually honest, there is no objective criteria here. None. We can look for some, we can pretend there's some, but at the bottom of all those, arguments is someone's opinion. And that's just the truth. So if you're honest with yourself as an art professor, you have to tell yourself that, and probably your students that at some point. But on the other hand, I will be grading you, and I will be deciding if you should pursue this as a career. So that problem in my mind is where this film came from, literally, because I couldn't stop thinking about it over time. I could not stop thinking about the whole world that I live in as a documentary filmmaker. A lot of my friends are critics and artists, and we live in this little world where, to put it bluntly, we believe our opinions about art are simply better and more meaningful than others. And it's not even a judgment. That's just the truth of what it means to be part of this kind of artistic, critical, intellectual class. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to interrogate it because I feel like we don't spend enough time interrogating it.
And also I'd bring in Adam Smith, who in The Theory of Moral Sentiments says, basically you like it when your friends like what you like, but you really want them to hate what you hate. And there's something to that. It's a deep insight, right? If I like Kenny G and you don't, okay, well, so whatever. But if I hate Kenny G and you think he's really good, oh my gosh, where's your job? What's wrong with you? And I think for those critics, that's a lot of what's going on there.
Absolutely. And I want to bring this back to something you said earlier, because I think it's really relevant to this point. You described the music of Kenny G as being woven into the fabric of our lives, kind of whether we like it or not, right?
Yeah, for sure.
You don't need to know the names of these songs, but I know them all. It's like, oh,
Yep.
yeah, I know that one too. Oh, I've heard that one. And it's because in the olden days in America, there was something called mass culture, and Kenny G was a good example of mass culture. It was kind of seen as, you might say, the sort of lowest common denominator amongst many people. Therefore, it would be useful to put it in an office or in a mall or in a dentist's office or on hold with the bank, because it's not going to offend anybody. It doesn't have lyrics. It just kind of can be background music. So the reason I bring this up is that I think part of what offends people about Kenny G's music is that it is so useful. That it is useful as background music in and of itself, I think makes some people pretty angry because they don't want art to just be pleasant in the background. As you said, they want art to be disturbing society and changing the world and making you uncomfortable. And if it's too pleasant, which is really what Kenny G's music is, it's just very pleasant, I guess. That's what it's aiming for. And apparently it's what it achieves, right? Then that must be, there's something wrong with that. There's something bankrupt in there. And I think the usefulness of the music, and it's even in the titles of the songs, Going Home, Sentimental, Forever in Love. These are song titles that tell you what the music is for. Yeah. People don't use Going Home at the wedding. They use Forever in Love at the wedding. Now, there's nothing about those songs that seems particularly important to say this one's about going home and this one's about falling in love, but the titles are giving you very helpful clues as to how to use it in your life.
Yeah. Well, there's two aspects of this. I don't think you get into in the documentary, but I've thought about them for a long time. And I'll say it this way. Now, suppose that we found an album. It's a undiscovered album by the Beatles that was never released. Now, would you be like, oh, well, who cares? They were so 1960s, 1970s. I mean, music's come so far since then, don't you think? Would you really want another one of those? And of course, every Beatle fan would be very excited, and a lot of non-Beatle fans would be excited because they're great songs. What was beautiful then is still beautiful now. What's wrong with beauty? And I think there's some of that in your story of Kenny G.
Wow. Yeah, I love thinking about that. And part of what I think is important there, as you said, is what's wrong with beauty. And this is something else that came up as I was an art professor for years and years. You know, students would sometimes say things like, particularly the younger students who were coming into an art class just kind of for fun, who were not serious about art in their lives in any way. And they would often ask me, you know, why is the art you show us so weird? And why is it so ugly? And these are real questions. And again, as a professor, I took them very seriously because I'd try to answer. What do you mean by weird? What is this not weird art that you're thinking of? You know, and what they're really thinking of usually is something in the pop culture sphere, you know. So I'm showing them avant-garde, video art from the 60s, and they're like, why isn't this more like Lord of the Rings? A relevant question. There are things about popular culture traditions that are more conservative, let's say, with a small c. They're more popular. They're more like drawing on a tradition, and they're more leaning on things like beauty and satisfaction and maybe some pathos, but hopefully a catharsis at the end. And these are venerable traditions that I, as an artist, don't have any disdain for those traditions. And I know, because I've done a little bit of research, that this idea that you described that Hegel maybe introduces to some extent is so new. I mean, it's historically so contingent. We didn't always think that art was for disturbing your psyche and, causing trouble and, maybe furthering the revolution. That's a pretty new idea about what art should be. As far as we know, art has traditionally served very different functions. Again, we're speculating to some extent, but it seems likely that, in the past, before the modern era, that art was more about ritual and tradition and coming together, binding people together. Inspiration.
To move a person, to make their heart sing, to make them cry, make them love their fellow human beings more than they did before, worry about their own flaws. There's a lot of good things about art, outside of challenging, disturbing, and jarring. It's interesting.
Absolutely. And sorry, but when I was a graduate student, I found myself rebelling against this idea very instinctually, because, there was this kind of obvious thing once you kind of enter the art world. It's very clear that one of the rules of the art world is the more popular something is, the more suspect it is, and probably the worse it is. And I also saw this in pop culture because I was a child of the 90s. So if you're coming of age in the 90s, you learn pretty quickly that you like Nirvana until Nirvana is very famous, and then you don't. That's just the rule. And if you don't do it that way, then you're not cool. You're not part of modern discourse. And so I've always found that really troublesome and annoying because as an artist, I have always wanted an audience. And I want people to actually like my work. I want them to enjoy it. And I found that instinct was really not welcomed in the art world. And so I found myself moving more towards let's call it indie film, kind of economics and ecosystem and business world, and away from the kind of fine arts world, which I found insufferable in many ways.
Well, you said something I think quite profound. I want to dig into a little bit, and I want to come back to Kenny G in a minute. You said you like Nirvana until it turns out they're too popular, and then you realize, okay, now they're on the I have to hate them list. And I think, especially for young people who have, of course, an enormous role to play in popular culture and the economics of popular culture, belonging is very important. And I think it gets to Adam Smith's idea, right? It's one thing to like what everybody likes. You don't want to be too, you don't want to be the contrarian when you're young. But it's really important to dislike what everybody dislikes. And so that's a way that obviously young people rebelling against the authority of their parents, of their church, of their whatever it is they're in their upbringing. Music is a way to express that disdain. So, I Want to Hold Your Hand, which has got to be one of the least challenging lyrics of all time, was an incredibly challenging song when it came out and was seen as a challenge, partly because the way they wore their hair, the way they performed. The early songs of the Beatles were a way that people expressed their dislike of Frank Sinatra, who their parents liked. That's horrible. I mean, those are songs of my parents. This new stuff, whoever it was, fills a role, especially if it's disdained by the people who you want to disdain. And also, it allows you to dislike a whole enormous category of popular art to show that you're in this exclusive club of people who know it's lousy. And that I don't want to suggest that that's the way we all behave or everything's like that, but there's some of that in the world.
There is some of that in the world, and it can work in very strange ways. I remember when I was about 16 years old, I became obsessed with the Carpenters. I loved the Carpenters. My mother.
Penny.
Exactly.
Oh, boy. The Kenny G of
that's what I'm saying. I mean, so for my mother, the sound of the Carpenters was like nails on a chalkboard. And I was like, I don't understand. It's so great, and this is how it can work. And so with Kenny G, at this point, if you want to rebel against your boomer parents, the best thing you could do is say, oh, I love this Kenny G song, Songbird. It's so great. And there's a huge amount of that in younger people. And that was part of why I thought it was interesting to make a film about Kenny G now. I went to a few of his shows in New York when I first was getting to know him. And I met young people. I would always talk to the young people there, the people who looked like 18, 20, 22 years old. What are you doing here? And they would say things like, well, I'm a jazz conservatory student and my professors hate this stuff, but I see some interesting things going on. And I thought, well, this is the most amazing turnaround, isn't it? It doesn't take very long for it to be well, what's the music your parents hated? Well, it's Kenny G or Frank Sinatra, the Beatles, whatever it is, you're going to come around to hating that at some point yourself, which makes sense to me. Again, it's exactly what you're saying. It's about sort of defying expectations and having that be a way of bringing you and your friends together. But it also points something else, which is that I think there's maybe nothing objectively wrong with the music itself. And I tried to explore this in the film because any critique you can level at Kenny G, it's too saccharine, it's too easy, the melodies are too simple. They're too pretty. There's other music you like that you could say the same thing about. So there isn't really anything objectively wrong there. It's oh, there's too much reverb. Well, maybe reverb is just not in style right now. And in 20 years, reverb will sound amazing to people again. The melodies are too simple, but you're saying this and you love punk rock. That makes no sense. Or you think he's not good at playing the saxophone? Okay, well, again, you're saying this, but you love punk rock? That makes no sense. It's too pretty, but you love Pat Metheny, who makes really pretty music, whatever else you might say about it. It's not simple music, but it's very pretty. It's very soft. So there's nothing objectively there. Again, this gets back to the criteria we use to judge. It's just about how it fits into culture at a particular moment and in what it's resonating with people or not. And when you have somebody that's successful, who's got all these records out there and has the name recognition that he has, inevitably people are going to start hearing it in totally different cultural contexts from where it came from. And they're going to hear it differently. The sound of the 80s is different if you weren't alive in the 80s. It's just different, You might like it more if you weren't around then.
Oh, for sure. And it's an fascinating aspect of music that it is the soundtrack of our lives, obviously, and we have associations with music that we can't explain, that we love or hate for all those reasons. I want to see two other things about Kenny G's music and get your reaction. One is, I think part of the other reason he's disliked is that while he does seem to be working hard at his craft, he also works really hard at the sound through using the recording studio, reverb and double tracks and all kinds of, quote, tricks that I think are seen by the cognoscenti, the sophisticates, as cheating. The other thing I would say about him is that his music sounds a lot like it used to. There's not a lot of growth. And so that also offends the cognoscenti. I'm not sure why. Again, I wish Puccini had written 10 other great opera. I love Puccini. He could really craft a song. And before I forget, I want to mention, there's an amazing essay by Leonard Bernstein where he concedes, it's very similar to our conversation. I think he's making fun of Gershwin. Because, Gershwin, all these sweet songs like Someone to Watch Over Me and Embraceable You, melodies. This is George, not Ira, the lyricist. And I love George Gershwin. And Bernstein concedes at some point that maybe one of the reasons I really dislike his melodies and value what I did in West Side Story, Bernstein concedes, I don't think I'm as good at writing melodies as George Gershwin. And if I could, I would. It's not like I have to write this artsy, disturbing melody that isn't as sweet. He doesn't know how. And so he's going to look down on him. And it's a gift. It's a rare gift to be able to do that. But the point is that Kenny G's just all he can do is write a beautiful melody. He never tried anything harder. And I think for his fans, that's fabulous. It's a plus. It's a feature, not a bug.
Yes, that's true. And I think that one of the things I was trying to disentangle in my thinking about art by making this film was really being clear that we're separating some questions here. Like there's the question of, is it good or bad, which is a critical question by its nature. That means there's such a thing as good or bad. And I believe there's such a thing as good or bad, or else I wouldn't be working so hard to make what I think are good films, So that's a not irrelevant or unimportant question. And I think there's validity to the question. It's a different question than, do you like it or not? That is a different question. And that was one of the things that I was always trying to work with my students on. Like, let's separate our reactions here. Do you like it is different than is it good? And there's yet a third question, which is it art? Very few people would say Kenny G is making art. I don't know that I would say he's making art, even though I'm trying to be open-minded about what art is. There's something inside me that says yeah, but this isn't really art. And I want to question it, but I also want to acknowledge that is my belief, or that it matters to me in some way. And I also think that to those people who would say all he does is write, popular melodies, clearly they've never tried to write a popular melody, because it's incredibly hard. And I feel this is where I take it personally is that I tend to make films that are pretty entertaining, and I tend to make films that are funny. And it makes me personally upset that so many people who are very serious in my field, they act like those are easy things to do. Like I'm doing the easy thing. And I'm like, no, it's not. The easiest thing to do is to make something unpleasant that nobody likes. That is literally the easiest thing to do. So the idea that it's easier to make popular things makes me absolutely insane. Makes me crazy.
It's a great point. And it's really the same point about anybody can write a song you can whistle. No, you can't, right? To have them whistling or humming your songs as you come out of a musical there's only a handful of people who could ever do it. It's a small group. I want to talk about, we're going to get off this question in a minute of, it's the heart of your documentary though, so it's okay to, I think, to linger on it. I want to talk, and that's this question of the gap between how he's perceived versus, how by the public versus the critics. I want to talk about his collaboration, Kenny G. He's like glutton for punishment. He decided to use a Louis Armstrong song. He used Louis Armstrong's vocals and Kenny G's sax to create a new duet. Something that a lot of people have played, because now in the world you can do those kind of things. Seems like no big deal. Fascinatingly to me, or maybe not so surprising, is he chose the song "What a Wonderful World," which is a very Kenny G-ish like song for one of the great jazz musicians of all time. The lyrics, for those who don't know it, are "I see skies of blue, clouds of white." And if I were really gutsy on EconTalk, I'd sing it in the really bad Louis Armstrong version, but let's not do that. Louis Armstrong is universally revered as a top 5, I would say, jazz musician, and as a real innovator, a genius. So here's this not beloved by the critics guy having the nerve, with the permission of Louis Armstrong's estate, to use Louis Armstrong to enhance his own cred, street cred, pocketbook, you name it. And it's beautiful. Not my cup of tea, again, but it's beautiful. And I love that song, "What a Wonderful World." But the truth is, it's a pretty easy song to like. It's not, there's nothing edgy about it. But without quoting him, because it's a G-rated show, Pat Metheny did not like this. Pat Metheny's a jazz guitarist. So talk about what Pat Metheny, the spirit of it, and how Kenny G reacted when you talked to him about it.
Yeah, so this happened in the year 2000. Kenny came out with a song, his duet, What a Wonderful World. And it was very popular. It was a big hit. And I think this was like the straw that broke the camel's back amongst a particular group of people. Again, the critically acclaimed artists, the critics themselves, who maybe had been kind of stewing for about 10 to 12 years on how upsetting it is to them that he's so successful. And again, I can empathize with them. I really can. I mean, look, it's easy for me to laugh at them, but don't get me started on who wins the best documentary Oscar each year. I will sound just like them, I promise. Just as petty and snobby as any of these people. So Pat Metheny, who's a very well-respected jazz artist, part of the cognoscenti, let's say, he typed a kind of screed on a message board, which again, this is the year 2000. So who knows if he even understood how many people would be reading this, but he types this long rant about how upsetting this is. He calls it, what does he call it? Musical necrophilia is one of the G-rated ways that I could describe it, I guess.
He threatens violence too, right? Doesn't he threaten violence? It's scary. Yeah. It's a scary rant. It's not just a rant. It's a really out there rant.
He's angry. And so, yes, he ends it by saying, "If I ever see Kenny G, I'll wrap a guitar around his head." And you're like, geez, Pat. So now we can laugh about this, but there's something bracing about this essay that he wrote. There's something very authentic, I guess, about it. He is expressing an anger and an upsetness that a lot of people felt. And I think to this day, this thing he wrote on this message board circulates. Any day on Twitter, go type in Pat Metheny and you will find someone sharing this essay. They've just found it for the first time and it really says something important to them and they love it and they think it's funny. And it's this indelible document that I'm not sure he meant to create on a message board in the year 2000. And in fact, I wonder if Pat Metheny regrets writing it in some ways. I mean, again, think about the meanest thing you ever wrote in an email to somebody and the idea that it would circulate for all time might upset you. I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much. But yes, so Pat Metheny wrote this thing and this became a flashpoint in the jazz community to come together and say, finally, someone said what we've always felt about this guy. He's not good. He is ruining jazz. And that's really important for us to talk about is jazz, because he's not just a pop artist. He is someone who, depending on the day, will call himself a jazz artist, or at least will acknowledge that he's coming out of that tradition, but does not know much about jazz and isn't even embarrassed by that. And I think that upsets people. That really upsets people. And again, I can empathize with that. If there's some documentary filmmaker out there who I perceive to be not serious about the craft at all, but somehow makes, the biggest documentary of the year, that will bother me. And it'll bother me if I read interviews with them and they say things that make it clear that they don't know anything about documentary. They've never really thought about it that much. That would bother me. So again, I try to have empathy in this film. It's important to say that.
You do a good job.
The film is funny and I hope warm, I am empathetic to the stance of these fans. I'm empathetic to Kenny himself. I relate to him in some ways. And I'm empathetic to the critics and to the people who find his music odious. I really understand everyone's point of view, and I understand it more than I used to. And that was part of the joy of making the film.
I'd say it's not, I think one of the, besides the fact that it's interesting to watch and fun to watch and interesting and all that, it is a very atypical documentary in that it does not advance an agenda. It explores a question. And I salute you for that, as it being sort of, I think of as the ethos of this show. It's the subtitle is Conversations for the Curious, not Conversations for the Converted. And you were very fair, I think, to both sides, very respectful. I don't know what you left out, of course, which would be fascinating. But on that note, how much time did you spend with Kenny G in face-to-face, in his presence, roughly?
Probably like 25 days in making the film.
Whoa.
And then, since the film's come out, another 5 or 6 doing press together and promoting it.
One could argue that it's not that flattering a portrait. He's you get the man in this documentary, and there's some parts to him that may rub people the wrong way, but I guess he didn't think that. He's happy to promote it, and that's very interesting in and of itself. But 25 days is a very, very long time. With cameras rolling, what percentage of that?
Oh, about half.
Oh, my gosh. So you had dozens of hours of footage to choose from. Was it hard?
Oh, it's always hard. But I will say Kenny made it easy for me. I'll give you the 2 case examples, which is the critic interviews versus my time with Kenny.
Before you tell us that, just how much time did you spend with critics? You spent 25 days with Kenny G. How much time did you spend roughly with there's maybe 5 or 6 critics, music people in the show. How much time did you spend with them?
1 day each on camera, and probably like another day not on camera, like just getting to know them and having lunch and stuff like that. So much less time. But still
a ton.
Yeah. But the difference is Kenny is, for better or worse, a very consistent person. He is the same guy. I mean, he's always the same guy. I filmed with him all these days. I spent a lot of time with him on camera, off camera. No, I'm not claiming that I know the depths of his soul. I mean, I'm not like as close to him as, say, his sons are, or his ex-wives, or his best friends. But I did observe him over time, and he's pretty consistent. So every minute we filmed with him was good and usable, but it all kind of had the same feeling too. Like the things that you think are admirable and charming about him, and the things that you find maybe more disturbing or unlikable or something, it's pretty consistent. So his material was very easy to cut because it's very consistent. The critics were chosen because I knew they were curious people who would go there with me and like just be willing to entertain a lot of different points of view and to think about things I knew in most cases they had never thought about. Like, it's not easy to find music critics who really want to talk about Kenny G. I mean, I was afraid to approach them. I thought they'd be insulted. So I chose people who I thought were more open, more nuanced, more willing to go there with me. And so they gave me so much good stuff. I could have cut 6 different films with completely different points of view. Like each of those critics occupied so many different worlds with me in those interviews that we could have gone anywhere. Like you could have had just the mean stuff, just the nice stuff, just the stuff where they question themselves, just the stuff where they double down on their beliefs. Like there was just that was the hard part, was getting the critical argument right, because I didn't have an agenda, but I did want you to go somewhere And it was important that the film go somewhere and that you would leave the film feeling differently or thinking differently than you started. And so constructing that kind of critical argument part of it was the hardest part. Where do you go hardest on Kenny? What is it? Is it the question of cultural appropriation? Is it about his utter lack of knowledge of jazz? Is it about how he makes music in a way that people find offensive if you're really into jazz? What's the worst thing about him, quote unquote? And where do you position that in the film where people are willing to go along with you and they're not going to be totally turned off? That was the hard part, was getting all that right. Because people I found in my early cuts were shutting down too quickly and developing too much antipathy towards one side or the other. And that was shutting things down. So you had to find ways to constantly be like, okay, score one for the fans. Let's make sure we score one for the critics. Let's get Kenny in there, doing something that is a good point. And I found that it was very difficult to find the balance right. And I'm sure someone would say I didn't find the balance right, but for me, this was satisfying. I felt like you could watch the film as a fan and have a transformative experience, or you could watch the film as a critic and have a transformative experience. And that for me is super important.
Well, those people who think you didn't do a good job, they're idiots. So we don't have to think about them.
Well, they're probably people with agendas, right? I mean, so thank you for saying that you perceived in the film that that's what I'm doing. And I think that's why I love your show so much, Russ. And I've been listening to it from the very beginning. And I don't think I've ever missed an episode.
Oh my gosh.
Because I really resonate with your way of thinking and your way of engaging the world. And I think it's pretty rare. Especially over a long period of time where you do become more of an expert on things. It's pretty rare to find people who are genuinely excited to find out they're wrong. And to me, that's like the most motivating thing. That's all I want out of my films, is to find out that I was wrong about something and to feel that destabilization and that joy at having my worldview expanded once again and kind of landing in the world of wonderful nuance and confusion. I enjoy that. Not everyone does, and that is definitely the minority of documentary filmmakers. I'll give you that.
Well, thank you for listening. And I appreciate you staying with me, because in 2006, I think I was a much more opinionated person publicly as host, and I think I've become a better host. Maybe a better person in being, I think, a little more open-minded, but I don't know. That's not for me to say. I'm a different person, I'll say that. But I think I want to come back to what you said about the critics and the day or whatever time you spent with them and the challenge of cutting their material. For me, some of my favorite moments in the film are their moments of self-reflection, and you capture them. They come across as very candid and real, those moments of self-reflection. You surprise them. And they're forced to come face to face with some of their views that they probably never thought about. It's just, and I was somewhat brave of them, and they exposed themselves in that way in front of your camera, which I thought was really impressive on your part and theirs. Others don't rise so much to the occasion. It's a mixed bag among the critics, I would say, and Kenny G is a mixed bag of lovable and maybe not so lovable. One thing that's clear is that it seemed to me, I'm curious if you agree, Kenny G's something of a perfectionist. You may not like what he's perfecting, but he takes his craft seriously. He takes your craft seriously. I don't know how many times he said it off camera, but that you didn't use or that you cut, but certainly on camera he says, should we do that again? Could I do that better? And if you've ever been filmed by someone, you know that one of the hellish aspects of it is the director or producer or interviewer says, especially on video. It doesn't happen on audio so much, but on video, let's do that again. Okay, I'll do it again. Can you say it shorter? Sure, I'll try. How about shorter still? I'll try again. Let's try to see if we do it a little shorter. I've had it. I can't say it shorter without butchering it. Leave me alone, right? And I didn't get the feeling that if anything, Kenny G was a bigger critic of himself on camera than you were. Is that right?
Absolutely. I've never had a more willing subject of a documentary. He really wanted to give me what I needed to make the best film. And he really would he said it in the film, and he said it many times, as you rightfully guessed, off camera as well. Tell me what you need. I'll do anything. Like, what is it? Tell me. He never got tired. He was always professional. He was on every minute we were filming. Usually the shoot days would end because I would be tired and cranky, which is a very unusual reversal. So we started scheduling longer and longer days with him because he just would be like, let's do more, you know? So yeah, he was, and you brought up the idea of perfectionism, which is absolutely the case. He would even say himself, and he has said since the film came out, that when he looks at himself in the film, he saw that perfectionism in a kind of new way that allowed him to see that he like probably should dial it down a little bit, and that his obsession with being the best at everything he does isn't always praiseworthy and laudable, even if it's largely praiseworthy and laudable. So I think even he sees that in the film in a way that helped him see himself a little bit more fully.
So there's a moment, I think it's in the first 5 minutes of the film, might be the first 2 minutes, where it's probably you call out to him unmiked. How you feeling? He's on the stage of a concert hall. He says, underappreciated, or something like that. And he laughs, and you think, oh, that's cute. He is kind of underappreciated. And he says it more than once, and you get this, you know, methinks he doth protest too much. It appears to, he pretends, I shouldn't say that. He says out loud, he doesn't care what the critics think. He says out loud he doesn't care if they hate him for the Louis Armstrong. He says out loud he doesn't care about the new Stan Getz thing he created, which is really creative and clever, kind of creepy again. I think he cares a lot.
I think it would be impossible to imagine a human being who doesn't care at all. On the other hand, I believe, as he says in the film, it's all about putting in the reps, and he's had his reps with what he calls the jazz police. This is not new. Nothing that the critics are saying about him now hasn't been said 1,000 times before. And I believe him that he has learned to not care very much about it. It's easy to not care much about it when you're like that successful also. I mean, he's not exactly like struggling artist who the critics hate and fans hate. I mean, he's one of the most successful musicians on this planet, and he's the most successful instrumental musician of all time by pretty much any standard. So he's got a lot of objective criteria by which to say he's doing great and he's very good at what he does. And so he would say, why would I obsess about what some bald guy at the New York Times thinks? Like, he doesn't, and that's very psychologically healthy. I aspire to be that way.
Yeah, Kenny, by the way, has a lot of hair, and it's been a signature thing for him for a long time. So that's, you didn't just pick on the bald guy out of the blue. In a recent episode that you haven't heard yet, Penny, because it hasn't aired yet, I talked to Lauren Buckman about the creative process and his book Make to Know, which is a fascinating book about the creative process. And he mentions this concert, this famous concert of Keith Jarrett. And it turns out it had come up in EconTalk once before with Tim Harford. We talked about his book Messy. And the thing about the Jarrett concert, and I did a little more research on it, it's utterly fascinating. He shows up at a concert hall. The concert's at 11:30 at night. He's driven in Cologne. He's driven from Zurich. He's supposed to have had dinner. There's a mess up. He only gets a few bites of dinner. So he shows up at 11:30. And having been there earlier, he had discovered before dinner that they had the wrong piano. Instead of the full grand piano he expected, they had a baby grand. It wasn't a very good baby grand. It had real problems in the lower and upper register. And so he had to improvise a whole bunch of stuff in the he wasn't going to perform. He said, this is horrible. The promoter, by the way, was 17 years old. And it was the first, I think, jazz concert at the Opera House in Cologne. So it was at 11:30 at night because they'd already performed an opera and they didn't really want to give this guy prime time. And it's this legendary concert, which I'd never heard. And thanks to Spotify, I got to enjoy it the other night. And I'll hear it again. I actually liked it a lot. But the power of that concert comes from the fact that he's performing under duress. His back hurt, by the way. He's wearing a brace. He's hungry. He's exhausted from driving. He's got a lousy piano. And he makes lemonade out of all these lemons. And in particular, it's not just that he rises above it. The constraints themselves transform his music. So my thought was, Kenny G needs like something's wrong. Play a sax that isn't the right one. Maybe he could use a challenge or two where his perfectionism would work against something. I don't know, just a thought.
Well, I think it's a really good observation. And I think that mistakes and chaos and cracks and duress and constraints are part of what it creates, a kind of friction that is what makes art really meaningful to a lot of us. There's a kind of like, on the one hand, on the other handness, or like it's perfect, but it's perfect because it's flawed in this very particular way. And I think that Kenny, whatever you think of his music, I feel like I got to know his music so much by getting to know him as a person. I mean, it sounds so obvious, but of course, this is the person who makes this music. He pursues perfection and a kind of smoothness at all costs, both in his personal life and in his music. And that is what that sounds like when you've got someone with a very particular idea about what perfection is and will stop at nothing to get there. It's going to produce a very shiny surface. There's no texture. There's no mixed feelings. It's all kind of like, I'm making a song about falling in love, and it's going to be just that and nothing else, and no other color will be used. It's all kind of always one thing. And he even says to me, I didn't use this in the film, but at some point he was describing his perfect album experience. And he said, I want the album to be the same all the way through. I want it to be the same. And I was like, wow, that's really not what most people want out of an album. But again, I mean, it really is like this lack of texture that I think defines the music. It's the lack of mistakes. And, there's something there. I think there is something there in terms of like, how would you make this better art? I think that your suggestions are correct, but that's just not what drives him at all. He doesn't think that's true. He doesn't like mistakes. He doesn't like things that are out of tune or like a note that gets slightly muddled or mixed. He wants everything to be exactly the way he hears it in his head. And again, you and I don't like it because we like a different kind of art, but that is what makes his art successful as background music, as the soundtrack of our lives. I mean, it's that kind of shiny, perfect surface of everything.
Well, I like the soundtrack of my life to have a little bit of raw. I like Mark Knopfler's guitar for that reason. Yeah. But you said something interesting. You said that's not what drives him. What does drive him? He's got so much money. He hasn't discovered a new instrument or a new style. Maybe he likes the toys of the studio more than that are available now compared to when he first started. But it's an interesting phenomenon. Of course, love is very pleasant. Man naturally desires not only to be loved but to be lovely, and as Adam Smith said, and a packed house cheering your music is pleasant. But do you have a feel for what drives him? Why is he still doing this? He's 60-something years old, plenty of money, nice house, I guess.
I don't think he would be offended to hear me say this. He wants to be the best. And I think he believes in progress. And he sees a particular vision of what the best is at this thing he's doing. And he just wants to get ever closer to it. And no, it hasn't changed. He really has never left that. Like, there's a big part of the film where we go with him to his old high school and we learn about his high school band experience. and I kept that, I put that in the film, and I kept that in the film because in some ways I feel like he's never left that practice room. He just is still like, practice, practice, practice. If there's one thing he wants you to know about him, it's that he practices. Now listen, every professional musician practices all the time, but somehow it's not like the thing that they think is the most important thing about what they do. And that really gives you a clue about what he thinks is important and why he cares. He wants to be perfect. He wants to get as close to perfection as he can. I think he thinks that's probably the highest goal a person could have. And he's not totally wrong in some way. It is laudable to set yourself to a goal and to work really hard to get to it. I think that's beautiful. As an artist, it's the opposite of what I think I'm doing. I'm not aiming for mastery. That's not even in my vocabulary as an artist. I kind of like to bumble around and do my little investigations and move on to something new. And I want to look back at my career at the end and say, wow, look at all this different stuff that happened, like all along the way. It's interesting. The early period work is very different from the late period work. That's not the kind of thing that Kenny thinks about. And I spent so much time with him, asking him questions about art and art making and his artistic philosophy. And I gotta tell you, like, the longer I looked, the less was there. It's really as simple as it sounds. It's just like, I want to be great at this thing, and that means being perfect, and I'm going to work very hard at that. And people like that, and they can tell that that's what I do, and that's why they like my music.
He's Tom Brady, not going to retire until he can't play the sax anymore, I guess. Here's the thought that comes to mind. The movie A Star Is Born. Did you see that, the remake with Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper?
Yeah.
So I hated that movie. I despised it, mainly for the last half hour, which I thought was awful for a bunch of reasons. But there's a moment in that film that is utterly transcendent, and it's when the character that Lady Gaga plays is in the wings, and Bradley Cooper brings her on to sing the song The Shallow, I think is the name of the song. And it's kind of fun that I think Lady Gaga wrote the song, actually, but that's just sort of an extra bonus. But the way she sings that song, and you can watch a live version of it, I think they sang it at the Oscars, there's a rawness to her performance, which is so compelling. You can't take your eyes off her. She is leaving it all on stage, and she's exposing herself emotionally as she sings that song. And maybe she's acting. We know she is in the movie, but when we see an artist do that, expose their vulnerability and express it in some part of themselves that way, it's powerful. You connect with them. It doesn't look like Kenny G takes any chances. And I think the flip side of perfectionism is that loss from the unexplored. It's like going to the same restaurant every night. The food's fine. It's good. Like it. It's delicious. But don't you want to try something else? Different cuisine, different flavors? No. I want to get really like this one. And what I'm going to ask you is, next time you talk to him, I think he should do a concert with Lady Gaga, or he's got a thing with Kanye West. I don't know what the range of that collaboration is, but where he couldn't control things. I assume in his concerts it's unbelievably choreographed to the note. Is that true? And what do you think he would do if he had to confront it's risky, and you expose yourself when you don't know how it's going to go. You give up control, but you get something in return. He's not interested in that, or he can't do it.
Okay, so many things I want to respond to, because I love everything you just said. So first of all, on this question of like perfectionism, earlier you referenced this, but I want to explain it for your listeners. When Kenny goes into the recording studio, he will record those saxophone parts thousands and thousands of times, and he'll play the same two notes, in sequence thousands and thousands of times until he gets the one he thinks is perfect. And he shows us his Pro Tools timeline, and it's just like cut. Half of a note is like edited. And so I show that in the film because I think it's important to understand how art is made and how it does affect the sound. Like, that's the sound of it. The sound is of a person who is very controlled and doesn't like imperfections. I used the word imperfections earlier, but now you're giving me some more words: rawness, vulnerability, that edge of the uncontrolled. And I think every artist has to find a way to balance chaos and order. I mean, it's like Apollo and Dionysius, isn't it? Like, This is what we have to do. And everyone finds their own way through that, except for Kenny G, because he's just like, no, just none. Why would I do that in his mind? It's just not interesting to him. And I think that idea really struck me because, okay, there might be a criticism. There is a criticism of Kenny G that sounds facile, but I think I've learned is not. And that is that it lacks soul. The music lacks soul. What does that mean? It sounds like a stupid thing that music critics say to have something to say. And
it's a cheap shot on some level.
Yes, but you know what? I think there's something real there, you know? And the lack of rawness, the lack of vulnerability, I think it's that thing. And it's not about, it can be faked. It's exactly what you said. Like it is performed. It's not about like some ideal of authenticity that doesn't really exist. It's like, are you good at making people feel like you've given them a glimpse of your soul? And I think that is a huge part of what moves us about art. And artists who don't do that creep me out to some extent. So there's a creepiness there because you get that it feels like it's all surface and there's nothing underneath there. And that lack of something underneath that I'm going to now call a soul is disturbing, I think, to people.
I'm going to make a prediction. Music's a little different than well, maybe it's the same. So Kenny G has this opportunity before that sets in to take some risks. He's got this incredible oeuvre, this incredible collection of risk-free songs. He needs to take a chance. He needs to get out there. and I think I'm going to play cheap psychologist. There's something there. I'm not going to play cheap psychologist. It's so obvious. There's a fear there of failure, a fear of embarrassment, a fear of imperfection that I think is making him less of who he could be. I think he'd be more perfect if he was less perfect. Would you let him know that and tell him this next album needs to be totally improvised without
People
studio?
say this to me all the time, like, tell Kenny to like try writing in a minor key and like tell Kenny, and I'm just like I don't know why you guys think that your ideas about what art are, you know, which maybe I share, has anything to do with what Kenny is doing. It's not on his radar. He's not going to hear that and think, oh, I never thought of that before. It's just not, you know, okay. 2 minutes into the film, I asked Kenny a question, which was actually the first question I asked him in the interview. So it's positioned accurately in the film as to like how it really went. And I thought it was kind of a softball question. I said, what do you love about music? And he sort of is stumped by this, and he sort of thinks about it, and he says, I don't know that I do love music that much. And then he kind of like realizes that was maybe not the best answer, and he sort of stumbles around a little more, and he lands on what he does love about music, which is practicing.
Yeah.
Okay? That's what he cares about. That's what he loves. And if you love the music, it's because you resonate with that idea of like someone trying to be perfect, and it doesn't bother you that there's no soul there. It's not what you're looking for. If you get off the train at that point, it's very likely that you're probably not going to enjoy his music very much. Or if you do enjoy it, it'll be something like a guilty pleasure where you know it's bad, but you like it anyway, which again, we've already established is possible.
The Carpenters, and for me, it's bread. I would do anything. I can't remember the name of the song, but I like that song. I can't help myself.
Right. So I think that, you know, there's something very key in that insight that he doesn't love music that much, but he does love practicing. You get the feeling that, and I think this is true, and he'd agree with me, if he hadn't happened to go to a high school that had a really good jazz band that was winning national competitions, very important, not just good, but award-winning, the best in the country year after year, maybe he wouldn't have been a musician. Like it wasn't necessarily going to be music for him. You get the feeling he loves accounting as much, or flying a plane, or golfing, or investing, or, you know, he would have just been this person in any field, which goes against our ideas about what an artist is and must be. And I probably have those ideas, and I agree with you that that's why I have a hard time calling what he does art, and I have a hard time calling him an artist, even though factually it's art and he's an artist. I struggle to get there because I think there's something missing there that is missing in the person and is missing in the music. And I don't mean that as an insult. I'm trying to be accurate in my description, and I think I'm right.
Yeah, let's.
But just to be clear, the kind of his embrace of digital recording technology, which again, if you come from a particular generation or you have particular ideals, that digital smoothness, the perfection, the kind of CD technology, the smooth jazz format, all of that rubs you the wrong way because you're looking for texture. Literally, you're looking for something raw or gritty. And again, that's just not his concern. He's not struggling to balance those things. He just wants the smoothness. He just wants the perfection.
So I'm going to say your documentary opened my mind to his music in a way I'd never been open before. And I'm certainly, our conversation has as well. And I'm actually going to listen to some of his songs that I wouldn't have crossed my mind to listen to. And I hope that makes him happy. But he's doing, I'm not going to say he's not an artist at all. I would never say that. But he's doing a different kind of art. He is doing it's not what we expect of artists in the modern era, what we demand of them. It's a different thing for many of us. And I think that's what he is not doing. The personal exploration of himself, the world, whatever it is. He's doing something else. He's crafting something beautiful. He's an artist the same way that a craftsman in wood who makes a beautiful banister or a beautiful piece of furniture, and you go, well, that's beautiful. But having that in my house makes me feel good because it fits in and it's a certain color and shape and design, and it's well crafted. His songs are well crafted, and you can't deny that. And that serves a certain purpose.
And he does write his own music. All of his best stuff is stuff that he wrote. So there is, I have to take it back, there is a soul there. Like there literally is a soul there because there's Kenny and he's expressing himself. And I don't think he's doing it through market research. He's not a corporate product in the way that many of us might think he is.
He's not the Monkees.
Exactly. Yeah. And and part of the story of his career is actually the early years at Arista, where he is struggling against the demands of the record industry. They want him to be more like other people, and he is rebelling. And so I have to give him credit where credit is due. He did do something with his music that no one had ever done before. It wasn't like the world was pumping out Kenny G's in the 80s. Kenny came along, and what he did was so weird and strange and divorced from the tradition of jazz, which at that point was becoming a very unpopular art form. Jazz went from being the most popular music to amongst the least popular forms of music at that point, and that's worth reflecting on. But he came along, and he, for the first time in 70 years, there were best-selling jazz albums. They were Kenny G albums. In a way, you'd think, well, isn't the jazz community happy? Because now there's people love jazz, but they just like this version of jazz that Kenny does. And that, of course, that's not what happened. But yeah, there's something there where, do you know the terms rockism and poptimism? It's related, I think. So rockism is like a movement within music criticism that was not named, of course, at the time. But in retrospect, we look back and we say, how do we articulate that the Beatles are the greatest? Because they are now, right? So we have to say why. And this kind of set of ideas about authenticity, about the importance of writing your own songs, and about, kind of all these ideas that rock music embodies at its best. These are now the values that we have in music, right? So then we can't like Frank Sinatra because he doesn't write his own songs. There are all these artists who fall outside of that language. So flash forward to let's say the 90s, early 2000s, 2010s, some music critics start rebelling against that. And again, in retrospect, this movement becomes known as poptimism, which is to say that now you'd say Beyonce is obviously the greatest living musician. If you're like a music critic, you might say that, because now we think that these values of reaching the masses, like we are more poptimist as a culture than we used to be. And I think that's very true. You see it in movies as well. Film critics now, if you dare to say something bad about a Marvel movie, like the world will come for you and people will not give you jobs. So there's kind of an expectation now that the critical class essentially be less snobby than they used to be. And part of the hatred of Kenny G is a historical relic. People don't hate Kenny G now. I mean, they did 20 years ago when he was a threat. Now they're like, Kenny G, I don't like it, but I don't get so mad about it. You know, it's not, people aren't as angry today as they were 20 years ago.
Your next documentary should be on Billy Joel. I'm not a huge Billy Joel fan, but he's an unbelievably talented songwriter and performer. And I think he's tremendously underrated because his songs are a little bit too pleasant, which is just, that's neither here nor there. But you do point out just now, which I never thought about, he was an innovator, Kenny G. Just an innovator in a way that was not the way we usually think of as innovation, not like John Coltrane. But he did innovate a whole genre, I think, right? Smooth jazz, easy listening, whatever you want to call it. And there was a moment in his career, which you should describe for listeners because it's such an incredible thing, where he took a risk. He's on The Tonight Show, which is like his biggest break. He's on The Tonight Show, and he does something insane. Maybe he never got over it. Tell us what he did.
So this is like his big break moment. I mean, in the 1986, being on The Tonight Show is like the biggest platform you could have. Everyone in the country will see this kind of, you know? And he is usually on The Tonight Show, you get your main slot as a musician, you play the single, and then at the end of the show, as they're kind of playing off, you can play whatever you want because it'll probably get cut off after 10 to 20 to 30 seconds, and they don't really care. So Kenny's supposed to play the single, which is, you know, by the demand of Clive Davis at Arista, a vocal track where he plays along and plays a solo, which is what the record industry thinks he should do to break through. And then at the end, he says, well, I'm going to play my song Songbird, which is a song that he wrote all by himself and like did all the parts and recorded it in his own little apartment. And they said, great.
How old is he at this point?
Let's see, 1986. So I don't know, in his 30s?
This is 35 years ago. So he's not 65, right? Now,
no.
How old is he?
He's about 65 now. So yeah,
he's in his late 20s. He's in his late 20s, and he hasn't made it. This is his big chance.
And he really wants to make it, it must be said. I mean, he has demonstrated that he's willing to play ball with the industry to like make it happen. But something inside of him, okay, so then what happens is the people who are running the show come and knock on the door and they say, oh, we're running late tonight. You're only going to get to play one song. So come out and play your single. And he makes the decision in that moment to play Songbird instead, which was not what anyone wanted from him. It's not what the record label wanted. It's not what the bookers and the show wanted. His manager certainly didn't want that. But he did it, and it launched his career. And I thought that story was so important to say because, again, it's not what you think of. There's something so pre-digested seeming about the music. Like, it feels like it must have been made in a laboratory by some, like, corporate executives who were looking for the thing that would play for grandma, but also, you know, yuppies in the city or whatever. But it's not like that. This really was music that Kenny did by himself against the wishes of his record label.
And he starts to play the song, and when his manager or somebody realizes he's not doing what he's, quote, supposed to be doing, they're, you know, gesturing at him like they're furious, and he just plays. And the amazing thing is, it's not like the crowd rushed the stage and carried him off on their shoulders. Some executive's wife heard it on The Tonight Show, right? And said, I like that.
I like that, honey.
And the rest is history. And the rest is history, right?
Exactly. So, you know, the record label, to their credit, said, okay, well, we were wrong. This should be the single. Kenny was right. So they started putting their weight. And it was an era where having the weight of your record label behind you really mattered, because Clive Davis could personally get your song played on every radio station in the country. So he got his record label behind him, and they put a lot of weight into making that song work. And it was a huge hit. It was a massive, unexpected, out of nowhere hit. And it just played everywhere. It played on pop stations. It played on R&B stations. It played on jazz stations. And then because it was so successful, and then Kenny had another hit and another hit and another hit, that is where the format called smooth jazz comes from. it's not really a genre of music in the sense that it emerged from a subculture and then crossed over. Smooth jazz is truly a marketing concept. It was created by radio stations and by market researchers to create a format for Kenny G, because he was so successful and so popular. They were like, let's make a station or a bunch of stations where we can program around Kenny G. What else should we play? And by the way, Pat Metheny was a staple artist in the smooth jazz format, which is very important to understand because that's part of why he is particularly personally so threatened by Kenny, because in some ways he's been put in the same bucket. And he is rightfully sure that what he is up to is nothing like what Kenny G is up to. And I'm sure he found that personally threatening at the time. Yeah, Kenny G changed the world. I mean, he just did. Like, you don't have to like it or, but you have to acknowledge it.
You were saying...
Wait, can I actually follow up on an earlier question? Because you were saying like, oh, Kenny, he should introduce some rawness into his work. Well, what happens when you ask Kenny G to improvise? As a person, I discovered early on in my filmmaking with him, because sometimes you throw things at a subject because you're trying to capture a spontaneous moment. And early on in our shooting, we went to his high school, and the principal asked him to sign a wall for like notable alumni. And Kenny doesn't know he's going to be asked to do this because, I wasn't actually trying to like do anything. I just didn't think it was worth mentioning that he was going to be doing this. I figured it was the kind of thing he's done a million times. But he melted down in front of that wall. He didn't know he was going to be asked to do it. He didn't think in advance about what he was going to say, and he didn't practice writing it to make sure it would look good. And he was furious and absolutely stymied by this task. It was a horrible moment for all of us. Ended up being a great moment for the film, but I was like, oh man, this was bad. Like, Kenny does not want to be surprised. He hates surprises, I discovered early on. So I couldn't try to surprise him with anything. Yeah, exactly. So I think that there's something about that. Like, the idea of improvisation has come to be seen as really the hallmark of what we think jazz is about. And that's it wasn't always that way. There was a time where perhaps you would have said other things are what the essential, does it make you dance would have been an essential quality of jazz in the 40s. Not so much now. But now we say improvisation is key. And Kenny cannot improvise, does not improvise, and does not want to improvise. And he kind of improvises in his shows, but they don't feel very improvisational to me. They feel very rehearsed, and I think they are. And again, every jazz artist who's improvising is kind of performing an improvisation, like they've practiced and they have worked out a few things that they're going to do spontaneously in the moment, but they're selling it as true improvisation in a way that he is not able to, at least to my hearing.
I loved that moment in his high school. His unease was so palpable. He did a great job, by the way. What he wrote was nice. It looked good. How long did that take?
I think it took 7 minutes. And of course, in the film, it takes about 60 seconds. But in film language, it's like an eternity.
Yeah, right. If you had shown that full 7 minutes, it would have been unbearable. It was uncomfortable, as it was, because his discomfort was very apparent.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
The last thing I'll say is that if this were a high production values podcast, we would fade out to Songbird. You would have heard it a few times before now, and then we'd cut over to Going Home. But it's not that kind of podcast. But I have a feeling, just an intuition, that in the next 7 days after you've listened to this, listeners, you will stumble across a Kenny G song, whether you know it or not. But if you can't wait, you will find his music on Spotify and in malls all across the world, even in China. My guest today has been Penny Lane. The show is the documentary is called Listening to Kenny G. Penny, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you. This was so fun.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.